Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. Congressional Democrats are preparing to move forward without Republicans on coronavirus relief. There are just over 6 weeks to go until pandemic unemployment benefits expire, which isn't necessarily a lot of time in Washington. Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the House will move to pass a resolution next week that would begin the process known as budget reconciliation. Now, it would allow Democrats to then pass a bill in the Senate with a simple majority rather than 60 votes and effectively bypass any need for Republican support. Here's how Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer addressed the situation earlier.
We are in the midst of a once-in-a-century crisis. It requires a once-in-a-century effort to overcome it. The dangers of undershooting our response are far greater than overshooting. Our preference is to make this important work bipartisan, to include input, ideas, and revisions from our Republican colleagues, or bipartisan efforts to do the same. But if our Republican colleagues decide to oppose this urgent and necessary legislation, we will have to move forward without them. We have a responsibility to help the American people fast, particularly given these new economic numbers.
Those numbers he mentioned show the country's worst economic growth since 1946. U.S. gross domestic product fell 3.5% last year. It is the first American recession since the 2009 global financial crisis. Meanwhile, there are also alarming new numbers on the health front. 83,000 people have died so far in January, the deadliest month of the pandemic so far. The CDC projects another 85,000 could die in the next 3 weeks alone. 3 new COVID variants have now been detected in the United States. Coming up, we'll speak to a doctor in South Carolina, where the latest strain was found. The Biden administration's economic and healthcare agenda is getting underway. The president is reopening government insurance markets, allowing more Americans to purchase coverage they may have lost during the pandemic. He also took action Thursday to rescind and target anti-abortion rules from the previous administration.
Basically, the best way to describe them, to undo the damage Trump has done. There's nothing new that we're doing here other than restoring the Affordable Care Act and restoring the Medicaid to the way it was before Trump became president. I'm not initiating any new law, any new aspect of the law. This is going back to what the situation was prior to the president's executive orders.
Kris Van Cleave, Stephen Portnoy, and Liz Goodwin join me now. Kris is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Stephen is a CBS News radio White House correspondent. And Liz is the deputy Washington bureau chief for the Boston Globe. Welcome to you all. Kris, let's start with the coronavirus relief negotiations. If Democrats rely on reconciliation, could that trigger Republican backlash? And could it impact the bill at all?
Well, sure, it absolutely would trigger Republican backlash. It would essentially be going around Republicans altogether. And it opens up some processes that will be timely, where Republicans will get their opportunity to try to add amendments to the bill. And it also requires the Democrats to have everything in order. They can't lose a single vote. You know, it's a 50-50 split, so they're relying on all 50 Democrats and the vice president to get that done. So they have to make sure that their party is completely on board and completely on the same page with the legislation. If you have some bipartisan support, it gives you a little bit of a margin of error. But if you have bipartisan support, there are some non-starters in the president's bill as it stands now. So some things would have to come out. One of the big targets for Republicans would be that $15 minimum wage. Even the moderate Republicans don't seem to like it. In fact, Lisa Murkowski told me yesterday, she wondered out loud, why is it even in there?
Interesting. Well, Stephen, the Biden administration came into these talks hoping for bipartisanship. Is there any indication at all that that could happen?
Well, it certainly remains the hope, Elaine. You know, Norah O'Donnell spoke with Ron Klain, the president's chief of staff, and he said today, quote, "It's hardly dead in the water. I think it's gaining a lot of momentum on Capitol Hill." Maine Senator Susan Collins told us today that she spoke with President Biden by phone and talked about the possibility of bipartisan support for this COVID rescue package. As Kris Van Cleave reports, it's seen by most Republicans as simply too big, but also by Maine's fellow Senator Angus King, an independent who caucuses with the Democrats, who recently described it as something like monopoly money. We heard something interesting today from the White House press secretary, and that was that reconciliation, if it is employed by the House and Senate, would be a means to passing this bill, and it does not exclude the possibility that Republicans could come on board. I took that to mean that it's possible that maybe a handful of Republicans could come on board, but not enough to clear the 60-vote filibuster threshold. So that suggests that the thinking is that there is enough momentum behind this bill, perhaps enough to get it done on at least 51 votes, maybe not 60. But you'd need to use reconciliation for anything less than 60, because otherwise the Republicans could theoretically block it. The press secretary at the White House did rule out something that was suggested today, which is perhaps splitting the bill. The White House says it's going to be one big, bold package. $1.9 trillion is the ask. The president in the Oval Office today pounded the Resolute desk several times to say the most important thing he needs to get done right now is this COVID relief bill.
Interesting. Well, Liz, insurance sales through healthcare.gov exchanges were open as recently as December, but the Trump administration didn't put much into promoting the enrollment period. What is the Biden administration hoping to accomplish by opening them now?
Yeah, well, during the pandemic, a lot of people's situations are very in flux. People are losing jobs momentarily, then they're getting them back when things reopen a little bit. And it's kind of left a situation where you could lose your insurance rather suddenly. And so the Biden administration is hoping by having this 3-month period where you can enroll in the ACA when you normally wouldn't be able to, it'll kind of provide a safety net for people who are going through a lot of changes right now. You could apply in the past outside of the enrollment period if you lost your job, but you had to provide documentation and there was only a window after the job loss in which you could do it. So this seems to be a better way to kind of bring people in during this period. And then, as you mentioned, Elaine, the Trump administration really cut funding for getting the word out there about the ACA and the enrollment period over the past 4 years, especially the first 2 years. So in a way, this is also kind of their hope. The Biden administration is hoping to make up for that lost time and get more people into the exchanges. The more people who are in them, in theory, the lower the premiums and the stronger the program overall.
Stephen, on the foreign policy front, President Biden is pausing weapons sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates that were set up by the Trump administration. Why are they doing this, and what does it tell us about their approach to U.S. foreign policy?
It's described, Elaine, as a temporary pause to allow the new administration to review the deals that have been done with the UAE for the F-35 fighter jets and on guided munition systems for the Saudis. But behind it, it seems to be Saudi support for the war or Saudi strikes on Yemen against the Houthi rebels. And it appears to be a signal being sent to the Saudi kingdom that this government, run by President Biden, is not about to support or help facilitate the strikes on Yemen. So it's a temporary pause on those rather large, sizable sales of weapons that were brokered by the Trump administration.
Well, Kris, we learned this morning that a man was arrested outside the Rayburn House office building Wednesday with 2 guns and 20 rounds of ammunition. Now, you asked House Speaker Nancy Pelosi about the threat to lawmakers this afternoon. Let's listen to some of what she had to say.
What are you saying to your members about protecting themselves and what can be done for them to feel safe?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the letter from the members, but most of the questions, the items on their list have already been done. Perhaps they were not aware. I do believe, and I have said this all along, that we will probably need a supplemental for more security for members when the enemy is within the House of Representatives.
So, Kris, explain that. What does she mean when she says the enemy is within the House?
Well, we asked for some clarification after that, and what she told us was it means and I'm quoting her here, "We have members of Congress who want to bring guns on the floor and have threatened violence on other members of Congress." That she's referring to Marjorie Taylor Greene, the newly elected representative from Georgia, who there was some CNN reporting that some of her past social media had appeared supportive of violence against Democrat lawmakers, including Nancy Pelosi. Those were liking social messaging and things that occurred prior to her being elected to Congress. But that has sort of become its own controversy here on the Hill around this representative who is very much a Republican firebrand as a freshman. There is a call to have her expelled from Congress. There have been calls for her to resign. So that little controversy is going to keep going. But you know what we're continuing to hear from lawmakers, 30 plus lawmakers sent a note to Speaker Pelosi asking for more funds for security when they're in their home districts. There is real concern on the part of lawmakers about their safety, this sense that they may be a target even when they're outside of the Capitol gates. You know, there are thousands of National Guard and these fences that you can't scale that are ringed with barbed wire outside the Capitol. But these members of Congress leave those protected walls and go back to their home districts every week. And that is a vulnerability. Most of them don't get security the way that Speaker Pelosi and others in leadership have their own security details. So there are definitely some concerns on the part of lawmakers about their safety right now.
I know you'll continue to watch that. Liz, I want to ask you about a pair of trips involving Republican lawmakers and former President Donald Trump. What do we know about the House Minority Leader's trip to Mar-a-Lago, where he met with Mr. Trump, as well as Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz's travel to Wyoming to protest against the number 3 House Republican Liz Cheney?
Yeah, so I think both of those trips are just a great example of how the atmosphere on the Hill has changed so quickly among Republicans after the January 6th attack. It really seemed like there was a moment there when there was kind of a core group of Republicans that were just so shocked by what happened on January 6th, and there was really a desire for accountability, I think, for the president. That was sort of a nascent desire, and obviously Mitch McConnell kind of personified that by saying he was, leaving the door open to an impeachment vote for President Trump. But the pendulum seems to have swung a little bit back in the other direction, even though it's only been, a little more than 3 weeks since that attack happened. And when Representative McCarthy decided to go and visit him in Florida today, even though he did take a stand earlier and say that he believes Trump bears some responsibility for what happened on January 6th, I think that just showed how quickly that changed. And, President Trump's PAC or political group released this statement after this meeting saying, Trump's endorsement is the most valuable endorsement of all time, or something like that. So they're using that meeting as proof of his political power, and McCarthy is buying into that, and you can see the effects of that in Congress.
Liz, I'm just curious, where does Mitch McConnell fall in all of this? Because he seemed to make clear that he wanted to kind of move past the Trump era for the Republican Party, at least the establishment in Washington, D.C. And when you have Kevin McCarthy traveling to Mar-a-Lago to meet with the former president, that would seem to be sending a very different message.
Completely, yes. And I think they are in very different political positions. McConnell will probably not run again in 6 years. He just won re-election. He sort of has a easier footing when it comes to dealing with the base that still likes Trump. He doesn't have to worry about a primary, whereas someone like McCarthy obviously wants to be speaker one day. He's facing a lot more political pressure from the base. But even McConnell has backed off some of his original hints that he wanted to just make a clean break with Trump. And I think that's because his caucus in the Senate, they don't want to get primaried. They're scared. And he's sort of reflecting how they feel. And that's happened relatively quickly. This week, Republican senators just kept saying, we just want to move on. I just want to move on. I heard that again and again. So there's really just no appetite for accountability there.
Really fascinating to hear about these evolving dynamics. All right, Kris Van Cleave, Stephen Portnoy, and Liz Goodwin, thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.